The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
Have a tree.
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism? Hello and welcome to What's Your Ism? I'm Sudipto Mondal. Quickly, let me tell you about our studio, give you a quick update. We are now fully soundproof. That door I told you about in the last episode, we fixed that door and now we are completely soundproof. Those little holes have been plugged. This studio is probably now 90% done. And that's all because of your help and your subscriptions. I keep talking about these subscriptions and appealing that you subscribe to the News Minute and News Laundry. And often in these appeals, we talk about how, your support helps us keep our news free. I do believe that in addition to that, there is another reason why you should subscribe to our outlets. And that's because of the kind of stories we put out, the kind of material that we cover, from art and culture to law and politics. I do think that we are an educational outlet, just as any other online educational portal. And that, I think, is a good enough reason for you to pay. If you agree, do subscribe to our joint subscription plan, the News Laundry and News Minute. Now, today, on this episode of What's Your Ism, I have a lawyer, a scholar, and an activist, Nikita Sonavane. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope I said your name correct. Sonavane or Sonavane?
Sonavane.
Sonavane. Nikita Sonavane is a lawyer by training. She's the co-founder of Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, which is based in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh. She's also on the editorial board of Article 14, the outlet which is run by Priya Ramani and Samar Halrankar. They do some fantastic work. You should check it out. She's also a fellow at the Ashoka University and a visiting fellow at the Oxford University. Is that correct? And yeah, go on. You're saying something?
No, I was saying I'm not a fellow at Ashoka University. There's an Ashoka Changemakers Fellowship that I'm the recipient of. Yeah.
All right. And you're now, I think, a few days away from once again leaving the country, going abroad for some. What are you going for?
Yeah, I'm going to do research at the University of Cambridge as a visiting scholar at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. So working on colonial histories of biometric surveillance in India.
All right. And you're a Dalit feminist, the founder of a law firm, the CPAP, the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, which has about 9 or 10 or 11, about a dozen staff. A globe-trotting Dalit feminist. Some would say that you are an elite Dalit, that, there's some in the judiciary who would call you creamy layer. Some communists would call you bourgeois.
Bourgeois, MacBook
Bourgeois,
loving.
creamy layer, MacBook loving. Yeah. But Nikita, the reason obviously I'm kind of poking in that direction is to tag first and foremost, before anything, you're doing all these things, and in the things that you're doing, it is both a reason to celebrate that a Dalit woman is doing all of these things, but it's also a reason perhaps to feel a little mellow because of the fact that it has taken so long for a woman such as you to emerge on the scene. Now, this is one small crop. Maybe among the men, you have Anurag Bhaskar, who's right now at the Supreme Court. He's a registrar there. And he's also written this book on the ideas that shaped the constitution and Ambedkar and all of that. Now, this is a very small crop. When you speak about the creamy layer, there's a very, very small creamy layer in a profession, correct me if I'm wrong, which is filled with legal families which have a history going back 200 years. There are law firms which are some of the oldest ones are 2 centuries old, and some families, their ancestors have been in the courts which are pre-Mughal, in the Mughal courts, and then in the British courts, and today they are in the Supreme Courts and the High Courts of India. In that kind of a setup, how important is it for a Nikita Sonavane to exist, your work, and how it is challenged by this structure? Can you talk about that to start off? I will, of course, come to your law firm and what you do, but first, give me a sense of the ecosystem in which you work.
Uh, the ecosystem is, I mean, it's like you said, it's even, I think, by the standard of, how close knit certain fields are. I think the law is, and the field of law is quite exceptional because there's obviously not just, you know, upper caste hegemony in the field, but it's also very, very familially dominated, right? And so, like a lot of my journey also, doing the work that I'm doing has sort of started, and this as a result of saying I don't want to be part of this, what is known as the field, right? What is understood as the field of law, to be able to sort of redefine and set the terms for ourselves. And if we're engaging with these issues, then we're engaging with them as, stakeholders and not recipients. Um, so yeah, I mean, I studied law after having already done an undergrad degree, and it was a conscious decision because I did want to, understand the law in a certain kind of framework, in a sociological framework, uh, and the kind of questions that I am engaging with. These are also questions, of course. Several people before me have engaged with these questions, but I think for me, the sort of emphasis of doing this and doing this work and also being in this field is a significant part of that has been to create a space for more people like me, because when I was in law school, when I was trying to find internships or whatever, this sort of broad spectrum of human rights lawyer and researchers, there were very, very few reference points. There still are, and I think the responsibility is especially, for someone who is in the university space, or getting education now as a second generation learner. The responsibility is to be able to at least shift the needle forward, right? So that when people are coming after you, it's a tad bit easier for them, as it was for me, because there was somebody else who sort of pushed the doors open, or made sure that it was slightly easier for somebody like me to at least get the foot in. So yeah, I think uh, the idea is to be able to replicate that. I think it's quite insignificant if, if I'm in this field and everybody knows me and my work. We don't, of course, it's good for your work to be recognized, but what I'm interested in is not building a cult of personality, but contributing to building a space, an institution, a movement. And I think so, as long as I can contribute to doing that in some way, yeah, I think it's valuable.
Right. And what you say actually brings to mind this adage, right, which is Rosa sat so Obama could run. Right? By Rosa we mean Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks, who said, I'm not getting up from this white designated bus seat. I'm a black woman, I'm not going to get up from the seat, I'm going to sit. So that became a metaphor for Rosa sits, and the movement grows, and ultimately an Obama could contest. Now, in this, I do want to, like people such as us, I kind of invoke a certain shared experience over here, where we say that we've had our privileges, and these privileges somehow appear to have become an ISO, for a lot of people. Like you saw the Supreme Court judgment, the creamy layer judgment. There are these bourgeois Dalit. We were joking about it just a second ago. How do you respond to, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, when we talk about intergenerationally having been excavated, that our labor, our our lands have literally been excavated, appropriated, and that's coming intergenerationally. Now, when you're talking about a way out of that deep dark hole, you're talking also about building intergenerational capital, right? And that, again, like I said, it's become an eyesore. How do you see this entire question of this creamy layer discussion, and how important do you think it is for people to understand that it takes a certain amount of privilege, really, to be able to be that one Dalit person in a room full of savarnas, which is what is the case in the judiciary?
And that it's not the one Dalit person in being in the room. How many years and how many people have it taken to bring that one person in the room, right? And I think also this whole idea of the creamy layer, I think there is nothing more threatening to Brahminical status quo than a Dalit person who's there, who's asking questions, who's thriving, right? I think they're very used to, and they want us to be beneficiaries or recipients of schemes. They don't want us to be stakeholders, right? They don't want us to be in these spaces. They don't it There is something that really sort of threatens this already fragile, you know sort of Brahminical status quo, when you have a Dalit person who is there in these spaces, speaking in English, looking a certain way, basically appearing to be their equal, right? And I think just the appearance of that is extremely threatening, because I think then you can, because if this is a person who is, at least in theory, in your head you're equal and being able to ask questions of you in the same language, then it means that you are no longer the savior, right? You no longer get to be the good savarna person in the room, and that's the entire project. I think on different levels it is a project of the articulation of being a good savarna who's a good ally, who is saying the right kind of things, just doing the right kind of hand holding. I think, which is why a Dalit person who's there, or an Adivasi person who's there, a Vimukt person, a Bhujan person who is in the room, who's basically saying, I don't need you to hold my hand, I need you to be here and sit with me at the table like I'm your equal and treat me as such. I think that is what is extremely threatening, which is why they want to say that you're not Dalit, right? You're just a creamy layer person. You're just a person who is wolf in, what they say, sheep's clothing, right? So you have the caste certificate, you're not worthy of it, because the only way you're worthy of it is if you're a victim, and that being Dalit is synonymous with victimhood, and we will define the terms of what that victimhood looks like. So, it's as they say in Hindi, chit bhi meri, pat bhi meri. So, we are the people who are going to lay down the contours of what Dalit look like. Otherwise, you don't pass muster. And the creamy layer, I think, is an embodiment of that. The court has only, I think, legally articulated what so many of us have and continue to experience. I mean, I'm sure, Sudipto, so many people also just like being surprised when you say you're Dalit, right? Because there is this kind of image in the picture in the mind is the picture. And I think when they're trying to define this Dalit or the right Dalit, what they're actually doing is trying to define for themselves what kind of savarna person they want to be. So I think yeah, I feel like this whole thing about the creamy layer is an excellent insight into the mind of what it means to be, Brahmin or Savarna in this country.
Interesting. Now, what it means to be a Nikita Sonavane is also something I'm very interested in. This is about you. This is your time to talk and share your life story. Tell me what it took to become who you are. There are some very long shadows in the judiciary, let's even say, and people can really melt away over there and fit into the system. You did not. Okay, tell me about that journey, this journey that led you here. Then after this, we're going to get into that part about the CPAP. What does it do in Bhopal? How do you work? But tell me about your personal journey. Where did you study? Where did your first political spark happen? I want to know all of that.
So I grew up in Bombay. I went, my schooling was in Bombay. I studied, I did a BA, then I went to law school in Bombay. And I think I grew up in a household where I think the key to survival, I think for a at a very young age I learned was to try to assimilate, right? Because when one is growing up in a setup like that, uh, where the question of caste or any kind of proximity to the anti-caste movement or space was quite limited while I was growing up. I think my father, when he got a government job, I think for him, at least in the 80s, being a Dalit person in the government sector was obviously far more daunting than it is now. And I think so for us, the push was to be able to get English education and to be able to access these spaces that would allow you to not seem Dalit. But it's one of those things, I think, when even when one is trying to pass, when one is acutely aware of the fact that one is trying to hide. So I think when i was I was growing up, there was always a sense of immense dissonance. And I think it's a sense of dissonance in terms of, you're sitting in a classroom where the person sitting next to you seems like you, right? So they will, which is the whole creamy layer thing, where they say, oh, but we are the same because you speak English. You're getting the same education that I am. So then how is it that you are staking claim to your identity? I think for me, when I was growing up, it always felt like, yeah, this is, we are books that seem to have similar looking covers, but it's still reading very different. Because I'm trying. It's not like I'm not trying to make it identical, but it's still not working. It's like the ball just doesn't drop. So then I think at some point, I think while working through the dissonance, especially when I went to college, I remember they had screened this documentary there called Jai Bhim Comrade. Xavier's is one of these very left liberal
Okay,
kind of.
before college, just to understand this dissonance that you spoke about, I was speaking. I often speak to people from the community who talk about this dissonance in terms of the cultural thing. So in a Bombay, the moment you say Bombay, to my mind, it is that place where the streets are filled during Ganapati. Is it a cultural dissonance? Is it a culinary dissonance? Is it a political dissonance? What were these, you know, unfitting, ill-fitting things?
I mean, it's a lot of it. So, I mean, also Bombay, of course, given the history of anti-caste politics in Maharashtra, it also has that, right? So you have Ganpati, but you also, like, during Chaitya you will, as in during, for on Bhim Jayanti or during Mahaparinirvan, then you will see the streets flooded, right? So
And your
your
family was invested in these practices of
yes,
Bhim Jayanti.
yes, yes.
Okay.
I mean, but still, I mean, because where we grew up, because 20, 30, like I think by the time I was a teenager, there was a certain kind of mobility that we had already acquired. So then we managed to move into a place which had predominantly savarnas, right? So when in my early teens, when one is already feeling very shaky about the self, you're in a place like this. So you're seeing that there are all of these, and then there are these mixed signals, right? Because people are doing Ganpati, Diwali, everything, and you have no sort of cultural reference point to any of this. You're obviously partaking in it because everybody is partaking in it, but you don't know the significance of it, right? And so I think for me, I mean, culturally also politically, I think there are parts of the city which are where of obviously there are lower caste communities that are living where you are seeing this. But when you're going to these schools, like my school was in this place in Pawai called Hiranandani, so where my building was surrounded by Bahujan Bastis. But when I'm going to the school, it's in this Hiranandani where people are being dropped in chauffeur driven cars 5 minutes from their house. So you're going there and you're just like, okay, but which person am I? I'm very confused. And when you're in that space, if in this one odd conversation you manage to tell someone about your caste identity, they're very either quick to tell you, oh, but you never looked like this person, or you never looked Dalit, or just to be like, oh, you shouldn't even be speaking about this because you're here sitting with us. So जो भी हो गया वो ancient history था. अभी तो तुम यहाँ हो ना. Now see, we are all equal. अभी we are eating from the same tiffin. You are coming to your house. We are eating in the same plate. So I think the dissonance is immense. And also because now I'm able to speak in English, I have access to a certain kind of vocabulary, which obviously even my parents' generation didn't, right? So then it also means that it also puts you in this space of who am I? Because when you're going there and you're speaking the way that you speak and you're looking the way that you look, even in those spaces, everybody is like, ye kaun aa gaya? Who's this person who has come here? So you're sticking out like an outsider in every space. So you're not savarna enough for savarna spaces, and in some ways, when you're going back home, you're also you're passing off as an upper caste person. Of course, you've also tried. It's also deliberate, but you're also like, people are also like, oh, this is, there's a feeling of pride, but there's also a feeling of, oh, this is a person who has moved on. So yeah, I think the dissonance is, it's playing out in various ways, in everyday lives, in interpersonal relationships.
So interesting. Now, that is something that I suppose a lot of second generation Dalits in different contexts in the country can relate to. This insider outsider, where, I mean, growing up, there is this one time in which you want to pass so desperately that, I would, let's say, not acknowledge a relative in public, right? Yeah, and we've done that, and we know this insider outsider thing. Now, so there is a common thing over there, but then all this is happening in Bombay, and that's why I'm very interested in your the story of your growing up, because see, for a lot of us, growing up in a Chennai or a Bangalore or let's even say a Calcutta, or, these are not places which have a huge Ambedkarite movement, right? And what can you describe to me what kind of a culture, the existence of this Ambedkarite movement and all that, what kind of culture it cultivates? Are there these spaces in which there's a parallel conversation happening about our existence, about our history, our culture? What is it like growing up in Bombay?
It's I mean, I actually have discovered many parts of Bombay in these ways after I moved out of Bombay, and it's been like 8 years now. I think in Bombay there is a sense of celebration, which is the case also in Maharashtra around our identities. Because if you see on 14th April, it's like a festival. It's now when I live in Madhya Pradesh, you will see in, like, maybe in the Buddha vihars, there will be somebody who will, there will be something that will go on, or in areas where there are communities that are living, there will be a rally, etc. But here I feel like everything comes to life. Obviously, in some other parts of Maharashtra more than before, but I think it also comes alive, and there's also like that much stigma around it. Like I remember there was a classmate of mine in college who came to me and said, very close to Ambedkar Jayanti, and he said, oh, now it's just going to be so dirty in Dadar. We can't go there. And then another person said, oh, maybe we should definitely go there. Maybe we'll spot our maids there. So if you ever
And
want
you
to
are
run
listening to
in,
this conversation and knowing that
no,
you
it
are
is
going
saying,
there.
yeah, yeah, you're listening into this conversation, and obviously you're not going to dare to say, actually, we go there. My family goes there, and so maybe you will spot me there too if you come. So I think it's a so there's also, there is this literature. There are, like, when you go to Chaitya you will see on, on Bhim Jayanti also, you will see all of these stalls. You will, and it's a week long thing. I mean, in Maharashtra, in other parts of Maharashtra, it goes on for the month, right? So it's really, I feel like it's a celebration. I don't know how else to say it, but I just feel like and I think for so much of, like, anti-caste politics in our lives are associated with survival and struggle and resistance, but I think what you experience is joy, and then you realize that, this claim to personhood that you speak about, you see it happening in these spaces, right? Because you're not just playing up certain parts of yourself or performing your stories, or speaking to, जब मेरे बचपन में मेरे साथ ये हुआ. I mean, of course, there is a recognition of that, but there's also the fact that, we're here and we're in this together, and we're also here to celebrate somebody who paved the way for us, and we're going to have a bloody good time while doing that. So I think just being able to do that is what is so special about this place. But I also feel like then there are so many other parts, because there are cities within cities, right? And then when you go to these other parts of these cities, so it's almost like you're doing this masquerade. When you're here, you're a certain way. When you're going somewhere else, you're another person. And I think that is the struggle, right? To be able to be your whole self, authentic self, whatever that might look like. Because I think when somebody says you're Dalit, it's also whatever is the so-called mainstream conception of it is still trying to put you in a box, right? Whether it's legally, administratively, in various ways. But I think we are just composed of so many selves, and I think that's what it means to be Dalit, and that's what it means to be an Ambedkarite also, right? Being able to own all of those parts of yourself, and I think that is what the struggle and the resistance is all about.
The ever-changing self, to embrace
The
it, to be able
ever-changing
to.
self. Yeah, because I feel like savarnas can be anything that they want to, right? Today they are whatever physiotherapist, tomorrow they're like, oh, I want to go be a pastry chef, and they can be anything they want to. They can be nothing, and it's still valid. It's all still valid, right? Like I remember, I mean, all of this which is said against reservation, the people being like, oh, these guys are so lazy, and I was like, yeah, but why am I not entitled to being lazy? I really want to be lazy. I want to be able to slack off, just like any other human being.
And instead of being lazy, you go to college, something sparks you over there, you said, right? Something happened over there. So you have all of this organic learning, let's even say, which is happening through the family. You are experiencing this dissonance. And you stop short of saying that you found some of these answers when you went to college. Is that right? What happened when you went to college?
I think when I went to college, the first
Where did you go to college?
First St. Xavier's and then the government law college. So
In Bombay.
Xavier's was Bombay, yeah. Xavier's was, I mean, those 3 years I feel like completely unraveled me. Also because the first 2 years I carried an immense sense of shame because I felt like, look, but I got access to good quality education. Uh, you know, my parents have a government job. How the hell did I use reservation to come here? I should be extremely ashamed. I should not be speaking to anybody. And this documentary they screened, Jai Bhim Comrade, where the filmmaker is recording some people. There's this one still in the film where you see the name of the college. It says St. Xavier's College, and I think it's like there are students that are emerging from there. And these were peers of mine at the time, and I saw them sitting in the college on the big screen and them saying, oh, we work so hard to be here, and these people are just coming here. And I think when you're sitting there, it makes you feel very small, and you're trying to do this window dressing, right? You're trying to prop up a self that is appearing to be confident. So you think the only way you're going to be able to fix this is if you work hard, or if you're going to be able to speak English better, because not enough to just speak the language, you have to speak like them, right? You have to be able to get the accent right. You have to be able to, you can't say Bari, you have to say berry. You can't say Europe, you say Europe, right? So you're paying close attention to all of this because you think there is something about you're going to fix, and then you're going to feel all right. But obviously when you're so ashamed and you're trying to make sure nobody finds out that this privileged creamy layer person has walked in here with a caste certificate, you're also operating on a self that is completely shaky and almost hollow, right? Because it's not grounded in anything, and shame is not solid grounding for anything. So I think uh, that was how it was in the first 2 years. And I think when I saw that on the screen, it also made me very, very angry. And I think for the
On the
first
screen, as in you
time,
mean that film?
when I
Jai Bhim
watched that
Bombay?
film and you saw these guys, and I think that's when, because that film is also, of course, it has its criticisms, etc. But at that time, I was 18 years old, and there it starts with the death of a Dalit poet, Vilas Ghogre's, suicide, and then it takes off from there. It talks about the Ramabai Nagar firing, etc. And I felt like, there is so much struggle that has happened here that I need to try a bit harder, right? So there are obviously classmates of mine who are saying this in the film, but there are also so many other people. And I think at that time I was also, then I said, oh, let me just start. So I started reading, and I actively started reading Ambedkar at that time. And I think when you read, it's like a punch to your gut, right? And I think then it also makes you very angry. But I think for the first time, the anger was not at the self, the anger was at the world, which is also a good way, I think, to be angry, because for a very long time it felt like I was incapable of being angry with the world. The only person I was capable of being angry with was myself. And I think just being able to do that, that was the sort of the beginning. And I think that's how I even decided to study law, because I felt like, oh, I need to be able to understand the sort of fabric of what this constitutional democracy is, right? And also, Baba Saheb being able to make meaning of, the world through this one avenue. So I think, yeah, I remember. I mean, I majored in political science, and we had to write a paper on a political theorist, and I was marked down for writing a paper on Dr. Ambedkar, because the acceptable only because I mean the teacher at the time said he's not even a political theorist; he's a Dalit leader at best. If at all he can be considered to be a leader. So I think, yeah, I think it was gradually, I think, the process of being angry. And I mean, and it's an ongoing process. I don't think I had an epiphany and it was like, oh, now I've moved over to the bright side and it's all great here. I think it's still being, because I think when the penny drops, you're also able to see any kind of anti-caste work does, or at least should be able to help us see how much Brahmanism we've internalized, right? Obviously, in the most obvious ways, but also in lesser known ways, right? In the way that we move, in the way that we access the world, how we desire, how we see, how we become. So I think that journey is still ongoing, and I think engaging with the law and then realizing that I need to disengage also from it uh, has been a huge part of that meaning making.
Thanks. No, thanks for sharing. Firstly, Nikita, that's a lot of you cut really deep there, and I can imagine that some of these things you mentioned in passing, but each of those sounds like a very poignant, and I suppose not all of them are pleasant memories. So thanks for letting us in to that story. Now comes this thing I want to really talk about, the CPAP, right? So at an age when most people are running around, scurrying around courtrooms with files tucked under their armpits, answering their seniors and working as a nondescript person in a law firm, at your age, you have started a law firm which employs about a dozen people who are running around for you. Tell me,
Running
I want to
around
know
with me.
with you. Okay, fine, with you. But I want to know the infrastructure part of the story. How difficult is it to put an organization like this together? This perhaps is one of the only law firms that I know of. I'm sure there are some others. I hope there are some others. But this is the only law firm that I know of, a large law firm headed by a Dalit woman. Tell me about the politics that led to it. Let's do that first, and then let's talk about the infrastructure. Just running an operation like this must be super difficult, right? So let's get to that later, but let's talk about how it happened, what kind of political space do you occupy by doing that? I'm sure because this only, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, it looks like a political decision. It's not a very sensible decision. The sensible thing to, the sensible, the sensible thing would have been to kind of find a senior, be working, like I said, scurrying around with their files. So you've done this. Obviously, it's a political decision. What is this politics? Why did you do this? And you've landed up in Bhopal of all places. Not a Delhi, not one of these big metros.
Yeah. So lots of different things. I think when I started, when I went to law school at the government law college, it's notoriously famous for not having any classes. So, people are just working and interning all through the year. So that's what I did for 3 years. First 2 years, I did a lot of human rights internships in other different parts of the country. My final year, I worked with some human rights lawyers in Bombay. And then you very quickly realize that, who gets to be a human rights lawyer and who's the person who's also going to be, obviously in today's terms, these are popular terms, be political prisoners, human rights defenders, and, win Magsaysay awards or whatever equivalents of that, right? And then there are some others who are just in these spaces like field workers and doing the heavy lifting. And I think my first sort of internship, like the project that I worked on while I was in law school, even slightly before it started, was on the death penalty. And I think two things were quite evident to me. One is, of course, that in the question of criminalization, but like a huge part of it, not even a huge part, actually at the heart of it is the police, right? And what was glaringly obvious to me is that this is entirely a Brahminical project, was not something that was engaged with right? It was I remember there was a lot of like curiosity around how these people are ending up in prisons, right? SC, ST, OBC. And it was never seen as like a design question. So I think one huge part of the motivation of doing this work was to foreground the question of caste, not see it as, like a specter of analysis or just as a factor in, analyzing the question of criminalization, but as saying that, this is central to the question. Like this is an epistemic challenge to the way that we understand police and policing. But also fundamentally, when I began working, I was one huge part of was to get out of Bombay because I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to be in a lawyer's office. First of all, they don't pay; they will pay you a pittance. So obviously, they only have people who are like the 3-4 generations of intergenerational wealth who are there, who are working penniless, and then obviously then becoming human rights lawyers to save the world. So I was like, ह्यूमन राइट्स लॉयरिंग करने के लिए मुझे भी पैसा चाहिए या कुछ भी करने के लिए पैसा चाहिए सो अदरवाइज आई विल बिकम अ ह्यूमन राइट्स कॉज आई कांट डू एनी लॉयरिंग इफ आई डोंट हैव मनी so then that was one part of it, and also just extremely how incredibly hierarchical these spaces are, right? Where it's especially I feel like spaces where there's a lot of posturing around being liberal. In spaces like that in particular, you see how like caste etc is playing out. So I didn't want to do that. And I think as I began working after I graduated, it became increasingly apparent. And I think so CPA came out of, or wanting to do this work and wanting to create an institution came out of, I think, several years of saying, I have been in all of these upper caste institutions, considered to be some of the best in this country, and I have tried to do this negotiation. I've tried to make these spaces better. So I've been very invested in this, reform karenge. All this, people will say, system ko andar se badlenge. I would think I was one of those people. And then I was like, even if you reform and you spend your entire life reforming these systems, they're still going to be violent. So what I instead want to do is use all of that time, energy, instead in building a space for our own people. So if we make mistakes, let them be our own mistakes. And let there be spaces where we are asking questions the way we want to, and not on somebody else's stuff, right? Or determined by somebody else's grammar or syntax. We will build our own vocabulary. So I think CPA came out of this desire and frustration to say, what, I'm done doing this negotiation. Let me take the time to see, if I can use that energy and time instead to build a space that is for ourselves, where we are asking these questions and we're engaging with them the way that we want to. So yeah, I think it came out of that, and Bhopal happened by accident, because I was looking to start litigating, and I didn't want to be in a Bombay or Delhi, and I wanted to do trial work, and so I moved to Bhopal to work with an organization that works with children belonging to Vimukta communities, also known as the Denotified tribes. And because there is so much historical criminalization and continuing day to day through the police, they needed some lawyers to work with them. And I was just looking to start litigating. So I just moved there. And I moved there, and I think that kind of cemented my decision to be like, there's a need for me to contribute to building a space like this. And that, research, not just going to the court, but being able to document why this is happening has to be part of it. Because the police is not going after X person because they don't like that person. It's not an individual decision. It's a structural decision, and there is not much empirical evidence that documents how these structural decisions are made by individual policemen, right? So yeah, that's how CPA happened, and I gave myself, I think, 2 or 3 months to say, I'm going to give this a shot. I owe myself that. Agar nahi hua, so then I will pack my bags, move out of Bhopal, find something else to do. But yeah, it was a shot that worked.
And few months have turned into now what? How much time have you been there now?
Nearly 5 years.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Now, I want to combine the second part of the question, which I talked about, where I want to talk about the putting together of this infrastructure. What does it take in terms of capital, physical capital, material things that go into making a firm, and also, the scaffolding. Now, in my years as a human rights reporter, my interaction has most often been with very well-meaning, let's even say lawyers and people in that paralegal space. But invariably, I found that they have this huge safety net, this social capital, this set of networks. I don't want to take his name, partly because I do respect him. There's this very prominent gentleman who often appears in the Supreme Court, and he is the one person who really takes the judges to task. Has said things in open court which nobody else has been able to say. But if you really dig a little further, you discover that his father was also a judge, and so on and so forth. And uh, my point is that that scaffolding, that safety net, how much of that is absent in your case, or how do you deal with the absence of that safety net? Secondly, of course, just the material requirements of setting up a firm. How did you pull that off?
Uh, so we are registered as a non-profit. So we're not. So all of the cases that we do, with the trial court, high court cases, these are all pro bono. Uh, and when we started, we were able to access, some philanthropic support to be able to do this work. But of course, that space, and this, especially in the last decade, has shrunk, right? To be able to access any kind of financial support to do human rights work. And Madhya Pradesh, also given its socio-political landscape, is not an easy space. But I think what has held us in good stead to be able to access that is the fact that people see value in this work. Uh, for better or for worse, caste has, in the last few years at least, become quite mainstream. And the question of policing and caste together is not a question that a lot of people have engaged with, at least in this fashion. So I think that being able to do that and being able to, put out a lot of good quality research work has allowed us to do this. But building an institution is not simply about, of course, the materiality of it is crucial, but building an institution, just being able to, work together as a team, and also doing it while staying true to your principles, right? Because a lot of people want us to, whenever I speak about my work, everybody is very quick to latch on to the communities that we work with. So they're very quick to say, oh, this is work with DNTs, this is work with other tribes, this is work on caste. But what this is work on is Brahminical policing. And I think, to constantly push that and say that we are not people who are just working on caste. We are lawyers, we are researchers. So it's very, very easy to pigeonhole our work, right? And I think there is also a lot of push from the outside to put yourself in those brackets, because that's what gets the money. Everybody is very happy to support work with poor marginalized people, so as long as you sell it that way, right? Because this is an entire philanthropic enterprise that is based on people feeling charitable and feeling good about themselves. So nobody feels very good when they feel implicated. When you tell people that actually this is about Brahminical policing and we've all contributed to it, especially, and some more than others, it's not something people want to put their money on. But I think for us, being able to do that, and being able to do that in a mainstream discourse which also views caste as a secondary question when it comes to the law or policing or criminalization, and also to be able to speak to policing as something that is not an enterprise to be reformed, right? Like, a lot of people, for instance, would want us to do police trainings, police sensitization, and for us to, hold our ground and say, you can't sensitize people out of not being oppressive. And a sensitized oppressor is still an oppressor. And I think to be able to push back also on the limitations of the politics of reform, these are things that have been particularly challenging to build an institution. Also, because when you ask these questions, and you ask, because also people like me and the people that I work with, because everybody on my team belongs to various oppressed caste locations. So we are, the idea of us, people like us being in a room is very appealing. It, all diversity, equity, whatever, what is that third eye, inclusion initiatives will give you full marks, right? Because wow, these guys are like poster children of diversity. But what is particularly threatening is when these people who are there are not just there as tokens, but they are there as stakeholders and they're asking questions. So I think the idea of Dalit women being in positions of leadership in theory is an appealing idea, but Dalit women exercising their leadership is not particularly palatable to most people. So I think navigating that has been particularly challenging, and navigating that across the board, not just in Madhya Pradesh, but also in the field has been a challenge. And
Interesting.
also, I
You
think
said
for me to, yeah, sorry. No,
no, no,
and
go
I
on.
think also for me to say that I'm a lawyer and a researcher. People are very quick to say, oh, but this is a Dalit woman lawyer or a Dalit woman researcher, or, reducing my work to activism. But it is, we're doing work that takes effort, we're doing work that is rigorous work, and therefore, we should be treated as lawyers and researchers the way that all other savarna lawyers and researchers are. I'm happy to be called a Dalit lawyer or a Dalit researcher, so as long as that kind of courtesy is also extended to my savarna counterparts.
Interesting. Now, there are a few things you said over there which I'm very interested in. And one of the things is where you talked about how you're changing the gaze in a sense, right? You're saying that you're not talking about as much about the people who are at the receiving end of the atrocity as much as, of course, you're doing that. But what you're trying to do is to turn the gaze upon the structure that perpetuates this kind of atrocity, the individuals within that structure. You're basically not doing rescue work as much as, let's even say, you're doing combative work, where you're combating a certain system and a set of individuals in that system. Now, tell me about the system. My question really is, that was just my reflection. My question really is, describe for me now, the structure. Describe for me the things you're up against, because here, we are looking at a bunch of life affirming, human rights conscious laws which are just a few decades old in a country which have seen the laws of Manu for, you tell me, how many thousand years. So give me a historical sense of what this fledgling, this one small period of 60, 70 years, and what it is dealing with in terms of the weight of history. Give me a sense of that history. What do we describe this Manusmriti ecosystem for me? What kind of laws are we talking about? And yeah.
So, when as people who are engaging in studying policing, one sees that the project of policing, and I'm making this distinction here between the police and the police and policing, right? Like the police are a manifestation of policing. The enterprise of policing is a larger enterprise of, maintaining social order, and that is the enterprise of, what you call Manu's law, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a project of creating, for the lack of a better word, disciplined bodies that are fitting within status quo through criminalization. So the project of policing has emerged around that. If one sees the history of, the Criminal Tribes Act, which is of 1871, which created this category of, hereditary criminals or criminals by birth, you see that actually, and there is so much focus on, how this category of criminals by birth, etc., was created. But what I am interested in is how this category has continued to be maintained, right? And how policing has emerged around that. So I think seeing, the way that various laws have emerged, or various laws have been formulated, whether it's the Criminal Tribes Act or, these habitual offenders laws, I think the logic of the status quo logic of, Brahminism still remains intact, right? And I think policing is what is central to maintaining that logic. So I think even if when one sees the Criminal Tribes Act was repealed in the year 1952, so, you use this framing of habitual offenders, which is, this administratively vague framing. You see that logic being replicated, right? When you say, use words like rowdy, badmash, gunda, which are all clear, like, legacies of the Criminal Tribes Act or these habitual now what are called as habitual offenders laws, one sees that one is speaking about an errant body, which is speaking about a body that is difficult to police but must be subjected to policing, because a huge part of this framing is the creation of people who are settled, not
Yeah,
just in
yeah. In
the
fact,
physical. Yeah.
to quote one of your own, I'm quoting from a paper of yours where you describe these people as a people on the move, people hard to watch, and people hard to discipline, right? People who are avarna, who are not part of, let's say, settled village society. That's how you described these over policed or surveilled population.
So, I don't want to say over policed, but I think people who have, because not everybody is subjected to policing of that, right? The only time people feel like the state feels like you need to be subjected to policing is when you're not towing the line. So if you see under the Criminal Tribes Act, the hijras were also criminalized because they said these are people, who are in the, like they're deviant sexualities. So these are deviants. So when you use the term deviant and you say X person or X group is a deviant, then the corollary to that is, so what is the norm? What is the norm that one is deviating from, that one needs to be punished for, right? Or that one needs to be pushed back to following? And I think that you see is the norm of Brahminism. And I think you see that playing out in different ways. And I think policing is part of that enterprise and in various ways. So even now, when you see laws, right, when you see these laws that are criminalizing conversion, that are criminalizing intercaste, interreligious marriages, what are these laws essentially doing? These are laws that are essentially saying, these are identifying the deviants and saying we need to punish them, or show them where they need to lie, right? So I think that logic, even 60, 70 years down the line, is a logic that remains intact. It's a logic also of the family. Like the family is the fundamental unit of policing. In the family they tell you this is the way, depending on gender roles, etc., this is the way that you should sit, who will talk to whom, how will you talk to your elders, what is the correct way to be. And I think that is the project of criminalization, and that is what laws in India, starting from the Manusmriti, have historically sought to enforce, and have sought to enforce this through criminalization and policing.
Right. I once again want to ask you a historical question about policing. The police as a force, I don't know. I mean, how long has the force like that existed? I understand from your writings that there were people who were designated, let's say, policemen or law keepers, you know, as almost as a part of a martial ritual. There were certain communities which would have these martial pretensions, and they would take on the job of policing. On the other hand, you're also seeing conscripts where you are assigning the chowkidar duty to a certain lower caste community. In the case of Maharashtra, there are the Mahars, right, who were assigned this task of being the chowkidar, right? And that of course is, though that person is a policeman or a chowkidar, the power dynamic is not quite the same, in terms of that person's relationship with the village that employs them.
Those roles have also changed. Like if you
Of
see
course they have.
police informants, etc., earlier they
Mhm.
thought it would be good to have dominant caste people performing those duties, but then they realized it's actually more effective to have someone from criminalized communities or lower caste communities doing this, because then you can get access to better information. And you will,
Wow.
so it's a force that has been around since the 1840s, first at a very village level, whether it's the village
A
watchman,
formal police force, has you
formal,
saying?
not a
Yeah,
formal police force, like a more disaggregated village level has always existed. And there was also obviously this kind of difference between, earlier the military was the one that was responsible for doing policing, and then they realized that
policing.
it's more effective to have that distinction between the military and the police. But this kind of formalization of the police force in the way that we see it now as a pan India phenomenon is a
Yes, yes.
phenomenon that is around the independence period, because then they realized that, you know the British realized that, look, there are many people, including dominant castes, who are part of the independence movement, and so there is a need to now institutionalize this force, have a lot of their people, and then conquer. But it's still a force that, while being this kind of pan India administrative unit, is still very, very localized. So there are many police departments within the police departments. Of course, there are state level, there are these formal administrative distinctions, But when you see the way that the local police operates, it is still very, very, their logic of functioning, their mode of functioning is still very derived from the locality they are in. So if a police station is located in an area where, people living in their jurisdiction are primarily, say, tribes, the way that they function, if you see their arrests, the kind of FIRs they file, those offenses will be very different from, say, a police station overseeing an area where there are predominantly Muslims. So it's an extremely low, because they also intervene in everyday lives of people, right? They intervene in everyday conflicts. मेरे पति के साथ झगड़ा हो गया, पुलिस स्टेशन. पड़ोसी के साथ झगड़ा हो गया, पुलिस. किसी ने पैसा नहीं दिया, पुलिस. So the police is as much embedded in the family as it is family.
Right. And where did the police, I mean, how did the police decide where to embed it themselves? Because I think you speak about this also a lot around the turn of the century, the 20th century. You're talking about the police collecting lots of data, and they're collecting this data in order to figure out how policing should be done, where policing should be done, and correct me, who should be policed. Is that correct? Yeah. So tell me about this era. What were the churnings that were happening there? What were these data collection processes, activities that were happening?
Always been great documenters. If you go back to the Thuggy laws, which also predates the Criminal Tribes Act.
What laws are these?
The Thuggy laws. So the category of the thug, it was supposed to be the first colonial discovery of crime, to say, these are highway robbers who kill their victims in a particular way with a silk scarf or whatever. This East India Company official called silk scarf, called William Sleeman, discovered this category of the thuggy. And the moment this thuggy discovery was made was through the creation of a thuggy department, which is where they would do exactly this. So fingerprints, documenting extensive amounts of information about what these thugs look like. So and that the information that they were documenting is also then what allows them to identify more thugs, right? So earlier it was very biological. Say, people who have certain kinds of measurements, so broad noses, a certain kind of jawline, a certain kind of protruding forehead, etc. So it was.
This is colonial anthropology at play.
Yeah, eugenics logic. But then they also did fingerprints, which is, of course, Nilakani and his friends are still doing it. But if you look at, fingerprints, footprints, etc., to say these are unique to every individual. So we must document these to identify. But whose fingerprints you are taking, that is already laid out, right? Matlab, if you see people who are nomadic, people who are like trans communities, etc., it's basically people who are not fitting into the social framework of what it means to be civilized, right? So lower caste people, tribes, these are all people that have already been identified as deviants. And then you're collecting this information about them and then saying, yahi log crime karte. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You collect data, yeah.
So tell me now, what period is this happening? This is happening
This is
around
1830s.
1830s.
Late
And
1830s,
this is a colonial administration in collaboration with local customs and ethos. How are they identified? Because these are also the avarnas of Hindu society, and here you have a colonial administration which is coming up with systems of policing, identifying people, eugenics you spoke of, this entire colonial anthropology. What is informing what, and how is this collaboration happening?
This thugs or habitual criminals is something that they've tried in other colonies also. But when they come to India, there is a preoccupation with mobs. These are people, colonial preoccupation with saying that mobs are dangerous. Mobs, and especially people who are on the move. Now, if you see people belonging to these Avarna communities, these are people, if you see their occupations, they are, traditional hunters, traditional traders, and moving in groups, right? So you have this system that is already here. And this system is also telling you occupation is assigned by birth. So it's a fertile ground to adapt what you know to the settings here. And then build your documentation and data collection from there about these people. And then use that research to identify more such people. So it's a really kind of well-oiled machinery. So which is why, so much of the critique of the law in India is around coloniality. But coloniality has wound itself and constructed itself around a pre-existing caste system. And it has served as a fertile ground to build its enterprise on. So that, like, if you see the thuggy system also, the thuggy system was something that was disbanded after a particular period of time, because they also, I mean, different factors, involvement of people in the, like, they just kept expanding the category that it became meaningless. At some points there were some Brahmins also who were identified as thugs, at which point I think they realized they went too far. So then they disbanded that categorization altogether and moved back to, saying born criminals. But I mean, all of that I'm saying, it's not such a finely linear chronology, also playing out differently in different parts of the country. So one has to bear that in mind. But yeah, but to say that, like, datafying people, collecting data on them has always been very central to this project of identifying criminals. But what allows you to create these data points is also that research, and that data was already available with the caste system, so that kind of logic is allowing you to create these data points. But and that is a legacy that has continued. So whether with the thuggy department moved on to the criminal registers under the Criminal Tribes Act, then it's moved on to the habitual offenders registers, rowdy sheets, or whatever we call them now. But that project has continued. So police data is actually incredibly robust in the way that they're documenting communities. It's very, very, I mean, of course it's casteist, but it's also a lot of extensive documentation about communities themselves.
We can call it what? Police anthropology.
Of course, the police are, like, the first kind of anthropologists. They were, in the way that they evolved various systems, they are the OG anthropologists, and they relied on anthropological methods to be able to do this.
Now, Nikita, see, we are talking about the colonial period, and you pointed out, of course, that they they adapted to the system, less than they kind of created it. The system already existed, and it was a fertile ground for them. Now, what is this system? I've done some study parallelly on this, and there were these different laws for different sets of people, going back in time. We talk about Mughal rule and the jizya tax for non-Muslims. But the jizya tax did not apply to Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and I think Marathas. Right? You have these exceptional laws where a Brahmin could not be punished for certain kinds of crimes. In Manoj Mitta's recent book, Caste Pride, the first chapter deals with confining people to the stocks. Now for those of you who might have heard this expression, laughing stock, right? It comes from this British style of punishment in which a person would be publicly put in what is kind of a confining device where their hands and their head would be, in this plank kind of a thing, and that those were the stocks. Now the same laws in back in England, these laws were brought to punish people who were refusing to work, under duress after the pandemic and things like that. Now these laws were imported in India, and like how Nikita said, where there was a fertile ground. So here there were already discriminatory laws, and when this, confining to the stocks as a punishment was introduced in the Madras Presidency, it was reserved only for the lowest of low castes. And how do we know about this whole episode? Ambedkar brings up this matter in the parliament in, I think, 1954 or something like that. But also because some upper caste person goes to court saying that I was confined to the stocks and this was a miscarriage of law because I am an upper caste person, and this is a law that applies only to, let's say, Avarnas or Dalits. Now there is this entire thing in which, like, we see the colonial administration, being very malleable, being adjusting, with the local customs. But then history also shows us that, the first breach from this kind of a system, the first effort to break from this discrimination was actually also a colonial experiment. Whether you look at the fact that they realized there were imbalances in society because of which they commissioned the caste census. They realized that these discriminatory laws existed. What happened when this person went to the court saying that I'm an upper caste, I can't be punished in the stocks, is that the British administration took a position saying that, hey, first and foremost, why are these discriminatory laws there? So, you are talking about modernity setting, emerging in the Western world, this entire post-World War, you have the League of Nations talking about human rights, outlawing slavery. You have this whole new egalitarian ideologies emerging, the state as a distributor of welfare. Now tell me, how much of a contribution do you think really, is this overrated, the contribution of the British in making a break from the past, giving us these modern laws? I'm not talking about policing per se, but the framework in which law operates in terms of discriminatory laws, let's say, that all laws apply equally across the board.
I mean, my engagement with this question has been in terms of laws that are criminal laws, at least, that are direct repositories of the colonial period, and um, one sees that that kind of framing has in many ways still remained intact. So nothing, there has been no significant upheaval on that front. I think a lot of people, whether like the case that you're referring to also, or in various ways, even after the constitution came into existence, one sees that there is a lot of life that people have breathed into the constitution, right? Different people approaching the courts, litigating their rights. Rohit Day's book, A People's Constitution, documents some of these cases, whether it's, the Bombay Prohibition Act, so on and so forth. So I think there is a lot of kind of meaning making of the law, or, bringing in line with the spirit of the constitution, which is done by various people approaching the courts and pushing the courts in a certain direction. I don't know how much of, I think coloniality can perhaps be credited for institutionalizing some of this. Uh, a lot of which was unsaid practices, unwritten practices, institutionalizing them for the better or or for worse. One now is able to at least push back against them and creating that system of checks and balances. But I think in terms of the laws, or what these laws were or replaced with, one sees that kind of system still carrying forward, or that kind of, you know it, that kind of legacy of what has been the caste system still replicating itself in various ways, which speaks to its pre-colonial existence, right? Which is what has happened with the criminal laws now. I mean, this entire exercise of repealing the colonial criminal codes and bringing in the new sahitas has been to say that this is a decolonial project. But what one has seen is that they've co-opted the language of decolonization, knowing fully well that the problem didn't begin with colonization, unlike what most other people seem to think it is. Of course, they've most of these provisions have just been replicated exactly how they were in the old codes. But I think that kind of language has also been co-opted in this certain way.
Now, how it plays out even today, this legacy of policing as an instinct, policing as almost reflexive behavior, reflexive savarna behavior, or in it as a public good. When you're talking about saving life and property, the police imagination of what is life worth, which life is worth saving, and what properties are worth protecting, and all of this. Now that should, I think, get us straight now finally into this CPAP project. What kind of cases are you dealing with? I understand that a lot of your work involves working with the Pardhi community, which is a denotified Pardhi. They are a denotified tribe. First thing, though, of course, the denotified itself means that there is that entire practice is outlawed now of notifying some communities as criminal. But if your work is anything to go by, that perpetuates. I mean, it continues to this day where they're targeted. How does the targeting of this community happen despite the repealing of this criminalization, this Criminal Tribes Act, which was, how does it play out?
We are a we are a research driven litigation and advocacy intervention where the research that we are doing is basically studying everyday forms of policing. So our work with various Vimukta communities, a lot. I mean, the Denotified tribes, many of them post the repeal of the Criminal Tribes Act in the year 1952, now like to assert themselves as identify themselves as Vimukta communities, which means Vimukta means free. So various Vimukta communities, which is whether it's the Pardhis, Kanjars, or uh, Kuchbandiyas, Sasis, Banjaras, a lot of these communities, we began working with these communities as lawyers because these were the communities that were being predominantly policed. Like even if one looked at Muslims, a lot of the Muslims in Bhopal, because it has a significant Muslim population, were Irani Muslims, which is a Vimukta community. And a lot of this, one will see that this kind of creation of these communities as objects of policing, one sees that language, which I mean, I've already said before, the history of the Criminal Tribes Act replicating itself, but in this habitual offenders kind of framework. So for us, when we were studying everyday forms of policing, contrary to what is the popular perception or contrary to what the police derives legitimacy from, which is, saying these are people who are needed or this is a force that is needed to put an end to heinous offenses, we saw that one is that there is policing, 95% of which is, and that is also me being generous, is contingent on criminalizing everyday lives of people through this like large category of petty offenses. So, hunting ko apne criminalize kar diya through wildlife laws. You've criminalized, making like traditional liquor like maua, etc., through excise laws. Or like you see people in bastis just accessing public space, playing cards, etc. You charge them for gambling. All of this. So a lot of this is, or like just people in groups. You said these are a group of thieves who've broken into people's house. These are dacoits, so on and so forth. Just people living their life has been criminalized through various kinds of laws, and that policing of these communities also extends beyond the realm of the formal criminal legal system, which means is even if I am not a person who has, against whom an FIR has ever been registered, I can still be treated as a suspect. I can still be treated as a bad character because I belong to a certain community, and the surveillance that I'm subjected to, or illegal detention, etc., is beyond even the reach of the formal criminal legal system, because these are, none of this is documented. Every day people's movements are tracked. Children from these communities are treated as habitual offenders. So these are all of this is, or the fact that even if somebody is found not guilty of an offense in court, they are acquitted by a court, they can still be treated as a habitual offender or as a suspect by the police. So these are powers that are extending beyond what are also the cardinal principles of criminal law, right? So innocent until proven guilty doesn't apply, because there is a presumption of guilt, and there is a presumption of guilt that cannot be disproved. So I think this is, I mean, for us, that kind of insight into how policing and the police are able to do this uh, is something that we are able to do through our work with these communities. But that is, I just want to say, whether it is representing people from Vimukta communities in courts, etc., that's one part of it. But uh, I think being able to understand the mechanics of policing that enables them to do this. One is that you're doing this, but I think how and the what of it is what we are doing, and we are looking to challenge, and which also in the context of Madhya Pradesh and other parts of also the country, various Vimukta communities have been resisting and challenging historically on a day-to-day basis. Like now, and I know, I mean, you and I have been speaking about this in Guna, uh, which is a district in Madhya Pradesh. Nearly 2 months ago, a young man called Deva from the Pardhi community was illegally detained the day before his wedding and killed in police custody. And just 2 days ago, there was an FIR that has been registered against 6 unnamed police officials for Deva's murder in custody. And I mean, this has come about because there is been this resistance from the family and the Pardi communities, not just in Guna but other parts of Madhya Pradesh. So I think that is what has allowed for the because policing is really the only institution in this country that has not undergone any reform. I mean, there have been these national police commissions that have been set up. Ex-IPS officers have gone to court. 2006, there was the Prakash Singh judgment, which said, you set up a police complaints authority, so on and so forth. None of, even lip service has not been paid. And I think, one sees, right, most recently I was reading in the papers about how a police official was suspended for basically safeguarding a Muslim person from a mob and, refusing to hand over a Muslim person to a mob. So that really tells you what the role of this institution, right? If a police official is suspended for doing this, it tells you what its job is. It and I think this kind of dependence that has been built on the police by making it seem like a public good, saying these are like even in the pandemic, I remember the first kind of responders were the police, to whatever was happening. So you've really made like an institution whose job description is supposed to be maintenance of law and order and investigation. You've made them like healthcare responders. You've made them responders in all situations. So that is an incredible amount of power in any institution, which is bound to just create an endless amount of impunity, which is exactly what has happened and is happening.
Nikita, tell me, in the way you've described how the police deals with the denotified communities, is a lot to do with prejudice. You said there is no documentation. It's not like the FIR is going to say that this ex-accused person belongs to a certain community, and that identification is used as a strengthening tool in the FIR or the charge sheet. Saying that. But then tell me, what got outlawed? I mean, what would happen before 1950 when the Criminal Tribes Act was in place, and what got outlawed? The keeping of data on these communities, is that what got outlawed? What exactly got?
I mean, the law in its entirety went away there because it was if you were so it's very hard to me what got outlawed, because exactly the same things are happening under a different legal rubric, except for putting, so you branded an entire community as being a tribe. So everybody who was in that community by default became a criminal. It was not something you could challenge. People were put in settlements. What one could perhaps like.
Movements were restricted.
Movements were restricted. You needed a pass to move out of the settlement. There were roll calls. These criminal registers were mentioned. Everyday movements, behavioral characteristics, all of that. We are seeing almost all of that happen now. It's just,
including a roll call.
I mean, not the roll call, but you do have patrolling of the bastis, and people do have to notify when their local police station when they're moving. We have Pardi communities here in Bhopal who have to notify the local police station even before they're getting married, because the assumption is that if a group of people from this particular community are congregating, they're congregating to commit a crime. So that is it's all replicated itself, but in this format. And FIRs, arrest records in Madhya Pradesh mention the caste of the person. And the moment you read Pardi, Kanjar, Sasi, Bedia, nobody is going to question whether or not this person has done this. Everybody across the system will say, ye log to karte hi hai.
Including the judges. And
Everybody across the system, there is this understanding that these are people who are committing crimes. So even when, like in the case of Guna that I was talking to you about, even when a person belonging to a Vimukta community has been killed in custody, or is basically the person who's the victim, right, is the receiving end of violence, what courts and the system will get into is this person's criminal antecedents. And I want to say that criminal antecedents does not mean these are people who've been convicted. It just means merely been accused of a crime.
no, even if they were convicted, my very basic understanding of law tells me that just because you are convicted in another crime does not make you a greater suspect in another case, right? That doesn't. These are two different cases.
Exactly. And you will see this across the board, even when there are instances of sexual violence against women belonging to Vimukta communities. The only thing that is constantly invoked is these are people who are criminals. If anybody reads the Dainik Bhaskar from the last 1.5 months from Madhya Pradesh, you will see Deva Pardhi, who was the person who is a victim of a custodial killing, has constantly been referred to as a Pardhi Badmash or member of a Pardhi gang.
The newspaper says Pardhi gang.
Pardhi gang, Pardhi Badmash. 2 days ago, they've published a report where they're speaking about how there has been an FIR that has been registered against officers of the police station where Deva was killed. And this was after a judicial inquiry report. And they said, Namchin Pardhi Badmash Deva Pardhi ke case mein. Which means popular Pardhi Badmash Deva Pardhi.
Well known, not popular.
Well known. Well known.
Wow. Okay. So, in addition to outlawing this targeted policing
It was
of
never outlawed
certain-
though. It was never
Okay.
outlawed, Sudipto, because
It was
a
repealed,
lot of-
right? The
it
Criminal
was
Tribes Act.
repealed. It was repealed. Yes, it was repealed legally, but the discussion in the Constituent Assembly, so it took 5 years for it to be repealed even after independence. Because the debates in the Constituent Assembly were that these are people who are criminals by birth and that they should not even be given the right to vote, let alone repealing this law. And then they set up the first planning commission. So set up the Iyengar committee, which said, because Nehru was big on sounding politically correct. And he said, it doesn't sound politically correct to say certain communities are, certain tribes are criminal in nature. Also, the term tribes is a bit of a misnomer because this includes different kinds of communities. I mean, there are nomadic, semi-nomadic, several communities that have a history of untouchability. So Dalits, different kinds of communities. So the tribes is like a kind of an all-encompassing term. But the Iyengar committee said, okay, you repeal this, but only after you replace them with habitual offenders laws. So it's just repackaged.
Oh, so the habitual offenders. No, now tell me about the habitual offenders law. You're saying it recognizes an ethnic identity?
It doesn't.
No.
It doesn't. That's the only thing they got out of it. But what that has actually done is made this more insidious. Because now,
Yes.
on the face of it, in theory, you will say, but this is not targeting any particular community. So that kind of explicit identification and targeting by the law of certain communities has been outlawed. That is gone with the Criminal Tribes Act. But if you read police manuals, or if you read prison manuals, like in Madhya Pradesh, it very clearly says habitual offenders may be denotified tribes as specified by the state government in the Madhya Pradesh prison manual. They should be kept separately in the prison. This is what it says in the prison manual. In the Madhya Pradesh police regulations, it very clearly says denotified tribes are habitual offenders. They should be subjected to surveillance. Their behavior must be monitored, so on and so forth. But ostensibly, you've done the same thing. It's just old wine in a more neutral seeming bottle.
No, but wait a second. You said that there are prison manuals in which they still they mention separately, and that there's what is the other document?
Habitual offenders is denotified. Even in police regulations, Madhya Pradesh doesn't have Madhya Pradesh state police regulation. This is the case elsewhere also, because this habitual offenders laws are in various states. Madhya Pradesh does not have a habitual offenders law. It has police regulation. So that is the sort of legal document that is giving legitimacy for this. But I also just want to say this, that a lot of people seem to understand the habitual offenders regime as a legal regime, which it is. But more than that, it has been institutionalized as a police culture.
And how do you fight that?
The only way to fight that is by getting rid of them. Because this kind of way of policing, you tell the police, if you tell the police you cannot maintain people's criminal antecedents, you cannot do this habitual offenders, this will be akin to telling them you cannot do your job. That is literally the job description. This is an entire enterprise that has emerged around creating this facade of criminal. crime in society by terming certain people as criminal and creating this law and order enterprise is a social order enterprise, and this social order enterprise has been maintained by the police. This is, and it's an elaborate facade by creating the criminal other that we should be scared of, because a lot of what is also passing off as crime is either criminalization of culture, is, or trying to solve for a structural issue through criminal law. Say if there's a case of sexual violence, you will say bring the police in, because if the police could solve Brahminical patriarchy, they would have done it by now. Or if the police could fix a public healthcare crisis, they would have done it by now, but it is not their job description. And a lot of what we are seeing as crime is also emerging from social inequality. So what policing is a massive red herring. And that to be able to maintain this facade or to maintain their relevance, you have to churn out this narrative of crime and criminals, right? That's how, which is why this whole framework of gunda habitual, which is also so common in everyday vocabulary, right? The moment you want to call somebody who's not a good person, you will say rowdy, bad character, what a gunda type person. This is the legacy of a policing project that has rested on generations after generations criminalizing people. I mean, we have children dropping out of Vimukta communities, dropping out of schools because of police violence. People are too scared to go to the local market because agar koi case hua hai, the police will arrest you. There is so much surveillance. Very often, and a lot of this mainstream discourse around policing has made policing and criminalization seem like it's an incarceration question, which it is, but a very small part of it is incarceration. A huge part of it is just this everyday intergenerational cycle of violence that has been perpetrated through policing cultures, practices, norms, and laws. And the habitual offenders regime is at the heart of this. It is what policing is. It is not a particular law. It is not a particular act. It is an institutional fabric.
An institutional fabric which is designed like, if it's almost like telling the ATS don't persecute Muslims. The ATS, the anti-terror squad is okay. I get that. It's their job description. That's worrying, because the way you describe it, it makes me wonder if it's so difficult to establish the existence of what is actually prejudice. How do you even go about fighting it? How do you establish prejudice in a court of law? How do you go about doing it? Because I'm assuming if you're fighting these Parthi cases, if you're fighting these cases for the Denotified communities, at some in front of some appellate authority, you are, I suppose, making the case that this is done purely because of the person's identity. Is that the case you make out, or do you just keep dealing with the material facts of the case, saying that there is no evidence for this, there is no evidence for that?
Both.
Do you go
both?
Okay.
Both, because
Tell
they're
me.
also tied to each other, right? The fact that you've not bothered to investigate, the fact that a random person is from a Vimukta community who was going about their life minding their own business has been implicated in an offense, these are all related questions, because it's a person from a Vimukta community, which is why the police also doesn't have to investigate, and which is why so it's as much as not having enough evidence on record, as much as it's tight. It's a question of the fact that of the person's identity. And I also do want to say something about the question of prejudice. It's sure, in individual cases, and one uses that strategy of both the individual and the structural, right? So the research work that we do is speaking to patterns, because it tells you that it's not a particular individual. Year after year, in various kinds of offenses, you're seeing similar patterns play out. And in individual cases, of course, there will be specific ways in which somebody's been subjected to violence or somebody's been falsely implicated in a case that one will point to. But I think the goal with being able to do both is to be able to help the system, and I don't just mean the courts here, but also in general discourse, to be able to underscore that the system does not have prejudice. that the system is actually the prejudice. You know what I mean? It's not like the police are casteist, it's that caste is policing. And I think the goal is to be able to spell that out.
That is deep. That caste is policing. That, in a sense, this police maintains the caste line. What is the line? And they hold that line. Now, we spoke a lot about Vimukt communities, but this last statement of yours suggests that it is not just Vimukta communities we're talking about. Uh, and as my last segment, I'm surprised we ran out of time so quickly. We crossed an hour, I suppose. Now, my last thing I want to ask you is, outside of the context of these Vimukta communities, a bunch of people who have been segregated, boxed into certain spaces, and then they are watched with a microscope, right? And here we're talking about Muslims, Dalits, may not be many Vimukta communities, but we're talking about urban deprived or urban
No, no,
ghettos.
there are very, very
There are,
much
okay. I'm sure they're
relevant.
part of the mix. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hyderabad
And
actually,
also
yeah,
lying
there is
at the intersection, right? So, for
uh-huh.
instance, like Muslim DNT communities.
Of course, of course, of
Yeah,
course.
so a
In
lot of,
Hyderabad, you will find that. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
lying at that intersection.
So, policing, urban policing, segregation, surveillance. How again does that further this description that you gave, which is that caste is police, that police is the caste police? How is that different from the experience of the Vimukta communities, or do you think it's the same?
No, so I think with the Vimukta communities, of course, there's a very clear historical trajectory of criminalization. Um, but there is also, like, the habitual offenders category has also expanded to include other marginalized communities. And
In a case of Hyderabad, you're talking about a community. No, no. Why I'm talking about Hyderabad is because, see, here's a community which was very much part of the bureaucracy. We're talking about Muslims here. We're looking at statistics of where they are today. I think 3 or 4% of the bureaucracy, where once they were 40% of bureaucracy. There is almost at a genocidal scale a certain marginalization has happened in Hyderabad at that scale. You're talking about a Vimukta community being uh, targeted for centuries. But here you're talking about the emergence of a new class of people who are so rapidly being boxed in. Talk to me about that and the role of technology in all of this piece, if you can.
so, we started engaging with technology driven policing, or the use of technology by the policing, because we were seeing that a lot of what has historically been done, the strategies that the police uses, are being digitally replicated now. Like, for instance, in Hyderabad, they've created softwares to map criminal hotspots, so crime hotspots where they say there is more frequency of crime, etc. Now these crime hotspots are, the police already knows what their crime hotspots are. Every time there is a case, they know which basti to go to. They know who to arrest. So you are seeing all of this now being digitally replicated, and also the police trying to seek cover through this well-crafted myth of technology being neutral. You will say, actually, I didn't profile this person as being a criminal, that facial recognition technology did. But those kind of markers, what we were speaking about earlier, right? Those, whether it's the eugenics or the systems of identification, those kind of markers are still remaining intact. And I think what we are seeing
How
in
so?
Hyderabad.
How so? You mean like facial features? You mean?
No, no, no. In terms of this kind of profiling of what a criminal looks like, right? So it's a
Okay.
person who's appearing a certain way, not exactly in the way of, the broad forehead, protruding forehead, or big nose. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm saying that kind of archetype of what a criminal looks like, right? So a person who, you know, has, like, say in the case of Muslims, say a person who's wearing a skull cap. Or I was actually speaking to one of the reporters from Hyderabad, and he said once he was walking somewhere, and he had long hair and he had piercing, etc., and then they stopped him to see if he had drugs, etc., in his bag. So a lot of this, of like profiling of a certain kind of people, which is then also finding its way into algorithms, right? That these technologies are built on. So that kind of profiling that has historically been done is now being reproduced algorithmically. And I think in Hyderabad, with especially with Muslims, because of the way that the last decade has been, we are seeing that kind of criminalization of Muslims happening in a more targeted kind of way. But if you see this Mission Chabutra, what is this Mission Chabutra? They're taking fingerprints of wandering Muslim youth. You see, the wandering is a old category, but now that old category and taking fingerprints, which was being done on registers, is now being done on a tab. But the constituency, the form remains more or less the same, right? Only the mode is now digital. And I, you know I'm not particularly equipped to speak to the depths of this in the context of Hyderabad, but I think there is also value to sort of unpacking this category of Muslims, right? Because, say, from the context of Madhya Pradesh, I can tell you, like, the Muslims that are criminalized for cow slaughter cases, or even alcohol, or a lot of these Muslim men who are treated as deviants or disturbing public order, will be lowered caste Muslims. So I think there is also a need to see how the heterogeneity of criminalization is playing out with technology, and that's the work that we have also been doing to map this historically, and to say that the project of surveillance has not been inaugurated by technology, and that if we are going to start and mapping this, and if we're going to start our timeline from Aadhaar, then that's a huge disservice, because this is a project that predates Aadhaar and the makers of Aadhaar also by several centuries. So to be able to understand what's happening in contemporary Hyderabad, it's important to look at what has happened in Hyderabad historically, and to be able to see how that has evolved and how technology has come into that. And I think in India, the kind of work that has, say, happened in the US around racist policing, or technology being used to reify race hierarchies, especially through criminalization, that kind of work is terribly lacking in the Indian context. Because in the Indian context, a lot of these are seen as new inventions. Everybody feels like AI is going to usher in some kind of apocalypse. The apocalypse is already here. It's been here for many years. Some people seem to have noticed it now, but people have already lived in an apocalyptic world for centuries and for generations. And I think to be able to see technology in that light is most crucial.
Right. And you talked about how the conversation is a lot more evolved in, let's say, France or in the UK or in the US, where racial policing is a big subject of research, is a subject on which a lot of mobilization happens of people's movements. Am I wrong in assuming that you are at stage one, where you're still establishing that this is a problem? You're still establishing not just the existence of the problem, but the antiquity of the problem, the genealogy of the problem. And it is at the next stage, once you have established that really you can fight, and we are not in a position right now. It's a little gloomy to say that, but can we say that at this point, when you're still trying to establish this as a problem, that police as a caste entity, that we are still in early days? And is that correct? How do you see your life panning out in the next 10 years in terms of this work? Yeah, if you say that right now you're in the stage of establishing that this casteism exists in policing and in targeting, in 10 years, how much forward do you think you would have moved?
No, I mean, yes and no, because I think establishing, for some people, they will constantly be at a stage where the problem has to be established for them, because they have chosen to not see it. You can't make someone see something that
in the court of law, in the court of the people, which is in parliament, in legislatures, in the court of law. These are the places in which these discussions can be had, for which I suppose you would have to have these fat dossiers saying that there is a problem first.
there is a problem, and I also think one has to be able to get them to see it in a more staggered manner, right? Like, if I were to now go to the court which is where a lot of the discourse is at in, say, in the American context, where they're speaking about defunding the police or saying that this is an institution that needs to be abolished. I mean, if that is where we were to start from, we would be sent packing. So I think for us, a lot of where we are right now is being able to demonstrate this through, pushing back against, pushing for the decriminalization of certain kinds of petty offenses, or to say that, look, how is it playing out in the way that arrest powers are exercised, or how is it playing out in the case of, custodial killings, or in the case of detention. So I think that kind of multi-pronged approach, and being able to make, because it's not just about establishing the problem, it's also being able to establish the length and depth of that problem, its scale. So I think that is where we are at in terms of demonstrating that scale.
And I wish you all the best in this journey. It is pioneering work, and I congratulate you for that work and all of those who are collaborating with you to do this work. But this is a conversation I think we need to pick up from time to time, and I will come back to you again, hopefully soon, to find out where and which stage you are at. So I hope to see you again very soon, Nikita. Thank you for this interview. That was Nikita Sonavane and Herism, What Drives Her. Some of you would have agreed with her. Some of you would have had some responses, reflections on what she said. Please share that with us. I do read all your comments. Very soon I'm going to get one of these accounts, and I hope to respond to these comments as well. Keep them coming in. You were watching What's Your Ism? I'll see you next time in the next episode.